The armory smelled of oil, metal, and faint powder residue, the kind of scent that clung to the air and seeped into skin, marking anyone who spent enough time among the racks of rifles and crates of ammunition. She was there as she always was, bent over a disassembled sidearm, her dark hair tied back and her expression a mask of calm focus, the kind of look that made everyone assume she was simply another technician assigned to keep weapons in order. To the soldiers who passed by, she was background noise, a steady presence with a rag in one hand and a tool in the other, wiping carbon off barrels and checking firing pins with quiet precision. They joked sometimes, calling her the ghost of the armory, because she rarely spoke and never seemed flustered, not even when younger recruits stumbled in laughing too loudly or when alarms rang in distant corridors. The truth was, nobody paid her much mind and she preferred it that way. The general himself would occasionally stop in, not to speak with her, but to inspect the readiness reports that officers placed on the steel desk in the corner. He had the kind of presence that filled a room, his medals gleaming against the neat lines of his uniform, his voice sharp as a blade when he issued commands. To him, she was invisible, or so it seemed, just another maintenance hand tasked with keeping his arsenal pristine. Yet there was something about her rhythm, the careful way she handled each weapon, that suggested training deeper than the surface. Her hands never trembled, her motions were too efficient, her eyes too sharp for someone who was supposedly just assigned to cleaning duty. Still no one questioned it. Not until the day the light caught the inside of her sleeve just right, and the general's world went silent in an instant. But before that moment, the story built slowly, like tension in a wire stretched too tight. The base was on edge that week, rumors of infiltration running through every briefing, talk of double agents and coded transmissions intercepting their lines. Soldiers grew jumpy, patrols doubled, and yet life in the armory remained steady, her figure ever present, oiling, reassembling, locking weapons back into their places with quiet clicks. Sometimes one or two of the younger privates would linger, trying to talk to her, trying to break through the silence that wrapped around her like armor. They would ask her where she was from, how she'd learned to handle weapons so well, or whether she ever grew tired of the monotony. She would smile faintly, never rude but never revealing, answering only in fragments that left them with more questions than answers. They called her Ice, thinking it fit her cool demeanor, but she never told them her real name and they never pressed. That anonymity was her shield. When the general entered that afternoon, his boots ringing against the concrete, the air shifted. He carried a folder tucked under his arm, his jaw set hard, his eyes narrowed in thought. He gave orders without raising his voice, each word striking with authority, and the officers around him scrambled to keep pace. She barely looked up, her fingers moving in their practiced rhythm as she polished the slide of a sidearm. But as he passed by her table, his gaze flicked toward her for the briefest moment, and something seemed to stall in him, like a man catching a half-forgotten tune on the wind. He said nothing, only moved on, but his eyes lingered a fraction too long and she felt it. She kept working, pretending not to notice, though her heartbeat had already quickened. Later, when the others had cleared out, when the hum of conversation had drained from the armory, he returned alone. His voice was lower this time, curious instead of commanding, asking her how long she had been stationed there, who she reported to, questions that were casual on the surface but edged with suspicion underneath. She answered in the same measured way she always did, revealing nothing, letting her silence speak more than her words. He studied her, and she could feel the weight of a man used to reading battlefields and enemies pressing against her, trying to strip away her layers. For a while, it seemed he would let it go and she relaxed her shoulders, turning back to her work. But then the rag slipped, her sleeve shifted up her arm, and the light fell across her skin, revealing the faint mark etched there, not a scar and not a tattoo but something older, something unmistakable. The general froze. His breath caught as his eyes locked on it, the rest of the world dissolving into silence. The mark was one he had seen only once before, decades ago, burned into memory alongside betrayal, blood, and shadows that had never left him. He stared at her arm as though he were seeing a ghost. She noticed instantly, her hand pulling the sleeve down, but it was too late. His face had already changed, the mask of command slipping into something rawer, something shaken. For the first time in all her months in that armory, the general was silent. The silence stretched heavy between them, not the comfortable kind that soldiers sometimes shared after long marches or battles, but a silence charged with recognition, disbelief, and an old fear that had not been spoken aloud in years. She felt it first in the way his gaze locked on her arm, his authority faltering for just a moment as though he were staring down not a woman in fatigues but a memory risen from the dead. She straightened, every muscle tense, her instincts screaming at her to move, to turn away, to bury the mark once more under cloth and shadow, but the damage was done and she knew it. The mark was not ordinary and men like him did not forget what it meant. He stepped closer, slower than usual, his boots softer against the floor, his voice low and raw as he asked her where she had gotten it. The question was simple but carried the weight of interrogation, of suspicion sharpened into a blade. She didn't answer immediately, her mind spinning through 1,000 possible lies, each one collapsing before it could take shape, because he was a man who lived on precision, on reading truth in body language in the flicker of an eye. Any falsehood would crumble under that gaze. So she said nothing, her silence holding the line, her grip tightening on the pistol frame in her hands, though she made no move to lift it. His eyes flicked from her hand back to her face and he knew that whoever she was not the nameless armory worker his record said she was. His voice hardened as he repeated the question, this time not as a man but as a general, demanding an answer, authority booming even though it never rose above a whisper. The mark on her arm burned in her memory, not from pain but from what it represented, from the years of secrecy and the promise she had once made never to let it be seen again. It was not just an insignia, it was a seal, a brand from a faction that the military had buried in classified reports and locked away in the forgotten vaults of intelligence. To see it here on her was to break open a wound that had been cauterized long ago. She finally spoke, her voice steady though her pulse thundered, telling him it was better if he forgot what he saw, that some truths brought nothing but ruin. It was the wrong thing to say because it was as good as admitting he had seen correctly. His jaw clenched, his hand hovering near his belt as though weighing whether to call guards or draw his sidearm. The space between them felt suddenly smaller, the walls of the armory pressing in. Yet even in his suspicion there was hesitation, because behind his hard gaze was something softer, something she hadn't expected, recognition not just of the mark but of her. He asked her name then, not the alias on her papers but her real name, his voice thick with something she couldn't quite name. The air went cold and her lips parted before she could stop herself, a syllable slipping free that she had locked away for years. His face changed at once. It was the confirmation he hadn't known he was searching for, and his silence deepened, no longer born of shock alone but of revelation. He remembered now, remembered a mission long buried in classified archives, a firelit night when he had seen that same mark on the arm of a comrade who was never supposed to have survived. He remembered betrayal and blood but also the impossible, the survival of someone they had all thought lost. She saw the storm pass through him, anger, grief, disbelief, and then the sharp return of command as he masked it all behind steel again. He told her quietly that she had no right to be here, that she was standing in the heart of the army she had once been sworn to fight, and that her cover was finished. She wanted to speak, to explain that nothing was as simple as the reports claimed, but the words tangled in her throat. For a moment she thought he would strike her down then and there, call the guards, end the charade. But instead, he turned away, his silence heavier than any sentence, his hand trembling ever so slightly as it rested on the edge of the desk. She realized then that the silence wasn't just shock, it was memory colliding with the present, a weight he wasn't prepared to carry. He told her in a voice so low she barely caught it that the past was dangerous, and if her mark was real, then there were forces moving beyond either of their control. Her heart tightened because she knew he was right, and she knew too that their collision was no accident. Fate or conspiracy had drawn them both back to the same battlefield, only this time the war was hidden, fought not with open fire but with secrets that cut deeper than knives. The armory felt different after that night, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension between them, holding it in the concrete and steel. She returned to her work as she always did, hands steady, motions flawless, but she could feel the shift in the way soldiers glanced at her, though none of them understood why. The general had not exposed her, not yet, but his silence was louder than any accusation, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he decided whether she was enemy or ally, ghost or soldier, betrayer or survivor. She lay awake in her bunk each night, staring at the ceiling as the hum of the ventilation system filled the dark, replaying the look in his eyes when he saw the mark, the way recognition had broken through his iron control. That mark tied her to a past she had tried to erase, a past where loyalty was tested with fire and those who bore the brand were not supposed to live long enough to carry it into the present. She had been a child when it was burned into her skin, part of an initiation she hadn't chosen, dragged into a war she never asked for. To most, it was the symbol of an enemy faction crushed decades ago, a scar on history erased in official reports, but to her, it was a reminder of survival, of betrayal, of promises made in blood. She had lived through the firestorm, through the night when her unit was annihilated and the general himself had led the charge that was meant to end them. She remembered his face in the chaos, lit by flames and gunfire, his voice cutting through the roar, and she remembered collapsing beneath rubble, certain it was the end. But she hadn't died. She had clawed her way out, hidden among ruins, reinvented herself under false names until she became the quiet armory worker no one noticed. And now, fate had dragged them back together, the hunter and the ghost of the hunted. The general, for his part, avoided her in public, never letting his eyes linger when others were near, but she could feel his presence like a shadow, circling, waiting, calculating. When he did speak to her in the rare moments alone, his voice was stripped of command, quieter, heavier, as though he was speaking not to an enemy but to a reminder of the man he once was. He asked questions that revealed the cracks in his certainty, why she was still alive, what she had done in the years between, who else bore the mark, and whether the faction was truly dead. She gave him little, offering only fragments, enough to keep him from condemning her outright, but never enough to free herself from suspicion. The truth was dangerous in ways even he did not fully understand. There were still those who carried the mark, scattered survivors living in shadows, bound not by loyalty to the old cause but by the scars of what had been done to them. And if he knew that, if the military knew, they would never stop hunting until the last ember was stamped out. Some nights she saw him pacing the corridors, his silence cracking into muttered words she could not hear, his shoulders bowed under the weight of a decision that threatened to crush them both. He had every right to end her cover, to drag her into the light, to make an example of her, and yet he didn't. Instead, his silence stretched on, carrying with it an unspoken recognition that the lines between enemy and ally had blurred long ago. She began to wonder if it was because he remembered more than he admitted, not just the battle but the moment their paths had crossed before, the moment he had seen her face among the flames and hesitated. That hesitation had cost him men, had scarred his career, and perhaps that was why seeing her alive now cut deeper than any wound. To him, she was a living reminder of a choice that haunted him, and to her, he was the figure who had once held her life in his hands and spared it, even if unintentionally. The mark on her skin was not just a brand, it was a bond forged in survival, a thread tying them to a history neither of them could escape. And though neither spoke it aloud, they both knew the silence between them was not going to last forever. The truth had a way of breaking through, and when it did, it would demand a price neither was ready to pay. The storm broke quietly, not with explosions or alarms but with whispers, the kind that slid through the corridors like smoke, curling into every corner of the base until even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Reports began to surface of coded transmissions intercepted nearby, faint signals carrying fragments of a language not spoken in decades, and though the officers brushed it off as enemy misinformation, the general knew better. He had seen too much, fought too many wars where the dead refused to stay buried, and now every fragment of static felt like a ghost's whisper clawing its way back into the present. She felt it too, the shift in the air, the way the soldiers stiffened when her shadow crossed their path, as if some part of them, buried deep in instinct, recognized that she did not belong, that she carried with her the echo of an enemy they thought erased. The general's silence grew heavier, but it was no longer directed only at her. It wrapped around the entire base, his commands sharper, his eyes more distant, as though every decision he made was weighed against some unseen scale. It worked faster in the armory, her motions crisp, her focus locked on the weapons in her hands because steel and powder did not judge her, they did not ask questions, and in their mechanical precision she found a kind of refuge. But even there, the whispers followed her, carried in the voices of young recruits who spoke of infiltration, of shadows slipping past their perimeter, of someone on the inside carrying secrets out. She did not know if it was paranoia or truth, but she could feel the circle tightening, and she knew it was only a matter of time before someone pointed fingers in her direction. The general never did, not aloud, though his eyes on her were enough, a weight pressing into her back each time she bent over a rifle, a reminder that he was watching, calculating, remembering. He wanted answers, but answers were chains and she had spent too many years running from them. Still, fate does not ask permission, and it was fate that brought the first real crack. It happened one night when the base shook with a single sharp blast, not enough to breach walls but enough to rattle every soul inside. Soldiers poured into the corridors, weapons drawn, shouts echoing through the compound, and amid the chaos she saw it, sprayed across the outer wall in ash and fire-blackened paint, the same symbol etched into her skin, crude and defiant, a mark that told the world the faction was not only alive but close enough to strike. Panic rippled through the ranks, old fears reborn, and every officer scrambled to hunt the phantom enemy. But the general did not panic. He stood before the smoldering wall, staring at the symbol with the same silence he had worn the day he saw her mark, and when his gaze slid toward her across the courtyard, she felt the truth pass between them unspoken. He knew now that she was not an isolated survivor, that others bore the same brand, and if they had left this message, then they were watching, waiting, planning something far larger than a smear of paint on concrete. That night he summoned her, not in public but in the isolation of his quarters, the air thick with the scent of smoke and the weight of the unanswered. He asked her what she knew, not as an accusation this time but as a plea, and for the first time she saw the edge of desperation in the man who had never once shown weakness. She wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the years of exile, the hidden network of survivors who had scattered across the world like embers refusing to die, but trust was a luxury she could not afford. So instead she gave him fragments, enough to confirm what he already feared, that the faction was not dead, that the mark he had tried to erase from history had returned, and that its bearers were not bound by loyalty to old wars but by the scars of survival. His silence deepened until it felt like a storm pressing against the walls, and when he finally spoke, his words were not those of a general but of a man remembering the ghosts he had failed to bury. He told her that if the faction had resurfaced, then blood would follow, because men in power did not forgive the return of enemies they had declared extinct. And she, standing there with her sleeve pulled tight over her skin, realized that her cover had never truly been protection. It had only been a pause before the inevitable reckoning. The mark was no longer hidden, not from him, not from the whispers, not from the world. War was coming, not with the clash of armies but with the unraveling of secrets, and she stood at the heart of it, the ghost in the armory, the survivor whose silence could no longer keep the past from rising. The corridors of the base grew tighter in those days, not because the walls closed in but because suspicion filled every empty space, turning glances sharp and conversations brittle, and though soldiers still came to the armory for their rifles and pistols, their eyes lingered longer on her, as if their instincts whispered that she did not belong among them, that her presence carried shadows they could not name, and she felt the noose draw tighter with every passing hour. The general meanwhile moved like a man carrying two wars at once, the one in front of him and the one inside his head, each order he gave snapping sharp through the air but weighed down by the silence that followed him into every room, and though he spoke little to her, she knew he was watching closer than ever, searching her face for cracks, for truths she refused to give. Then came the night when the whispers stopped being whispers and turned into alarms, the klaxons howling through steel corridors as explosions rattled the compound and gunfire split the silence. She was in the armory when the first detonation hit, the shockwave knocking rifles from their racks, and without thinking, her hands moved faster than instinct, loading, arming, preparing for battle with a precision that betrayed training far beyond what any armory worker should have possessed. The soldiers who saw her that night would never forget it, how she moved through smoke and chaos like someone who had walked 100 battlefields before, her face lit by muzzle flashes, her arms steady as she passed weapons to trembling hands and barked orders with the kind of authority they could not ignore. When the general arrived, his eyes locked on her in the middle of the storm, and for the first time there was no pretense, no mask of anonymity. She was no longer the ghost in the corner but a soldier born of fire, the mark on her skin hidden but her truth blazing in every motion. Together they held the line, back to back as shadows slipped through the smoke, their shots ringing in unison, and though not a word passed between them, the silence they shared was no longer suspicion but recognition, the acknowledgement of two survivors bound by a war that refused to stay buried. When the dust cleared and the attackers melted into the night, leaving behind only bodies and scorched walls, the soldiers whispered that it was her who had saved them, her steady hands that kept the base from falling apart. But the whispers carried danger too, because questions followed, questions about who she really was, how she had fought like a veteran of wars she should never have known, and those questions circled up the chain of command until they landed back in the general's lap. That night he summoned her again, his quarters lit by the dim glow of a single lamp, the smell of smoke still clinging to his uniform, and for the first time his voice broke not with anger but with something closer to plea. He told her that her silence could no longer hold, that the mark on her skin was no longer just her burden but his, because every attack, every symbol scrawled in fire, was a message meant for both of them. She wanted to resist, to lock the truth behind her teeth, but the weight of the night pressed too heavy, and finally, with her eyes fixed on the shadows dancing across the wall, she told him the truth, that the faction had never died, that its survivors had scattered like ash on the wind, hiding, waiting, adapting, and that she had been both fugitive and sentinel, carrying the mark not as allegiance but as curse, hunted by those who had made her and feared by those who had tried to erase her. The general listened in silence, his jaw tight, his hands clasped so hard the knuckles whitened, and when she finished he did not condemn her as she expected, nor did he draw the weapon at his side. Instead he stood slowly, his figure looming like a shadow of judgment, and told her that if what she said was true, then the war was not coming, it was already here, and they had no choice but to face it together, not as general and armory worker but as two survivors of a history everyone else wanted to forget. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not the uniform or the medals or the iron mask of command, but the man beneath, haunted by the same ghosts, bound by the same scars, and though neither spoke it aloud, they both knew that the silence between them had changed forever. The days after the attack passed like a blur painted in ash and suspicion. Patrols doubled, guards barked orders in the halls, and the base transformed from a garrison into a cage, its soldiers pacing the corridors like restless wolves waiting for a fight they couldn't see but felt breathing against their necks, and in the middle of that unease she worked as always, her hands steady on the rifles, her silence holding tighter than ever, though now the soldiers' eyes followed her not with dismissive indifference but with wary recognition, because they had seen her fight, seen her move with a precision that belonged to no ordinary technician, and though none dared say it aloud in front of the general, whispers of her past twisted like vines through every bunk and mess hall. The general meanwhile grew harder, his words clipped, his orders relentless, but beneath the steel in his voice was a crack she had learned to hear, a heaviness that betrayed the storm raging inside him, and she knew it was not only the faction's shadow pressing on him but the mark on her skin, the truth he had witnessed and chosen not to reveal. One night, as the wind howled across the perimeter fences and the barracks lights flickered under strain generators, he called her to the operations room, empty save for a map sprawled across the central table, its surface marked with pins and coded notes. He stood over it, his face lined by shadows, and told her in a voice stripped of formality that the faction had made their move. The intercepted signals were not fragments but coordinates, and if the reports were right they were gathering not scattered ghosts but organized cells, preparing to strike with precision. She stepped closer, her breath catching as her eyes traced the map, because she recognized the pattern, the way the signals curved in arcs and spirals, not random at all but deliberate, following a doctrine older than the base itself, one she had been taught as a child when the mark on her skin was still raw and burning. It was a message not to the army but to her, a summons she could not ignore. She told him as much, her voice tight, and for the first time she saw fear flicker in his eyes, not fear of the enemy but of her, because if they were calling to her, then she was no longer just a survivor caught in their web but a piece on their board, one they intended to use. He asked her then, blunt and raw, whose side she was on, and the question cut deeper than any blade because she had asked herself the same thing for years, carrying the mark of a faction she despised yet unable to wash away the blood that tied her to it. Her silence stretched, and in that silence he read truths she could not speak, his jaw tightening as he told her that whatever answer she chose would not just decide her fate but his as well, because he had covered for her, shielded her existence from the command above, and if she turned against them, his name would fall beside hers. She wanted to tell him she was on his side, that the ghosts of her past were nothing but scars, but even as the words formed she knew they would be lies, because the faction had never let her go, and the call written into those signals pulled at her bones like gravity. The night of the second attack came swiftly, the base rattling again with fire and smoke, but this time the enemy did not strike and vanish. They lingered, their shadows weaving through the perimeter like wolves testing the strength of the cage, and in the chaos she felt the pull stronger than ever, the certainty that they were not here for the base, not for the general, but for her. She fought alongside the soldiers, her rifle hot in her hands, her eyes scanning the smoke for symbols only she could read, and when she saw it, etched in fire on the hull of a burning transport, the world seemed to still. It was the mark, her mark, drawn in a spiral of flame, and within it a coded variation she alone understood. A call to return, a command disguised as invitation. She staggered back, the gun trembling in her grip, because in that moment she understood the truth she had been running from, that she was not just a survivor, she was a link, a living conduit between the world that had buried the faction and the faction that refused to stay dead, and the general's silence at the mark on her skin was no longer enough to keep the war at bay. When the dust settled and the bodies were counted, he found her sitting alone in the wreckage of the courtyard, her face lit by dying embers, and when their eyes met, neither spoke, because they both knew the choice looming ahead would tear them both apart, and no silence could protect them now. The confrontation did not arrive with subtlety or whispers this time. It came with the weight of inevitability, a tide rolling over the base that no amount of steel or firepower could hold back, and as the dawn bled pale light across the compound, the air itself seemed to vibrate with the presence of something long buried now clawing its way into daylight. She felt it first, before the alarms even sounded, a pressure behind her ribs, a recognition in the marrow of her bones that the faction was no longer content to linger in shadows, that they had come to collect what was theirs, and she was at the center of their claim. The general stood beside her in the command post, his face drawn with fatigue but his eyes harder than iron, and when the reports came in, sightings along the eastern ridge, signals jamming their comms, patrols cut down in silence. He did not flinch, he only turned to her and asked, low and sharp, what they wanted. Her lips parted, and for once she did not hesitate because the truth could no longer be avoided. They wanted her, the marked survivor, the ghost who had slipped through their fire and carried their brand into the heart of the army, and they would burn the base to ashes to drag her back into their fold. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant crackle of static on dead radios, and then he said the word she had dreaded and needed in equal measure. If they wanted her, they would have to go through him. The weight of it hit her like a blow because this was no longer just her curse but his choice, and in that choice she saw the man beneath the metals, the soldier who had once hesitated in the firestorm and now chose to stand beside her instead of against her. The attack began with precision, not wild chaos but a calculated strike that shattered the perimeter and flooded the base with disciplined fury, shadows moving with the same training she had once endured, their movements too familiar for her to mistake. She fought among the soldiers, every shot ringing like an echo from her past, and in the smoke she saw faces painted with the same mark she carried, eyes hard and unforgiving, comrades she had once bled beside who now looked at her as if she were a prize to be reclaimed. The general fought near her, his commands cutting through the chaos, his presence anchoring the men even as the walls crumbled around them, and for the first time the two of them were not separated by suspicion but bound by survival, their motions in sync as though they had trained together for years instead of standing on opposite sides of history. The battle surged, pushing them back into the heart of the base, and amid the clash she heard her name, not the false one she had worn like armor, but her true name shouted from the throats of those who bore the mark, and it froze her for a heartbeat too long. One of them stepped from the smoke, his face scarred, his arm bared with the same brand etched deep, and his voice cut through the chaos as he demanded she return, demanded she fulfill the destiny burned into her skin. Her rifle wavered, memories surging like fire through her veins, but before doubt could claim her, the general's hand was on her shoulder, steady, grounding, his eyes telling her without words that her choice was now here in the fire and blood, not in the echoes of a past that would devour her if she let it. She raised her weapon and fired, the shot tearing through the mark she once shared, and the man fell with shock in his eyes, not betrayal but recognition that she had severed the bond for good. The silence that followed that shot was deafening, a moment where even the battle seemed to hesitate, and in that heartbeat she felt the weight lift, the mark on her arm still there but its hold shattered, no longer a chain but a scar she had chosen to carry. The general stood beside her, his own weapon smoking, and when the fight surged back into motion, it was no longer her faction against his army but the two of them against the storm, back to back in defiance of history itself. The survivors of the faction retreated into the smoke, their calls fading into static, but she knew this was not the end, only the first fracture in a war that would stretch far beyond these walls. Yet as the fires died and the soldiers of the base looked to her not with suspicion but with the raw respect born of survival, she realized that the silence which had once been her shield was gone, replaced by something stronger, the choice to stand, to fight, to define her mark not by the hands that had burned it into her but by the hand she now held steady beside the general's. The fires that smoldered across the compound had barely settled into smoke when the last stage of her reckoning began. For though the night had been drenched in blood and gunfire, the silence that followed was not peace but the breath before the final strike, and she felt it in her bones as surely as she felt the mark on her arm burning with a heat that was not from the flames. The soldiers were exhausted, their uniforms streaked with ash, their eyes hollow with the weight of what they had seen, yet in that weariness there was also a strange resolve, because they had witnessed the truth, they had fought alongside the woman once thought to be a spy, a traitor, a ghost, and now they looked at her as though she were something else entirely, a figure who had chosen them over the darkness that had once claimed her. The general stood at her side, his voice hoarse as he gave orders to fortify what little remained of the defenses, but his gaze returned to her again and again, searching for something he could not put into words, perhaps the same question burning in her own chest. Was this the end of the pursuit, or merely the beginning of a war neither of them could escape? The answer came with the dawn, carried not by bullets but by sound, a low thrum that grew into a roar, shaking the very earth beneath their boots, and when the soldiers rushed to the walls they saw the black horizon blooming with movement, not infantry this time but machines, carriers of steel and fire bearing the insignia of the faction that had marked her long ago. She knew what they were before the others could comprehend, for she had trained in their shadows, marched in their columns, and she recognized the rhythm of their advance as intimately as she recognized her own heartbeat. The general looked at her, no accusation in his eyes, only the question of how long they had before the storm consumed them, and she answered with the grim certainty of experience, hours at best unless they moved now. The command center erupted with debate, voices raised in fear and desperation, yet above it all her voice cut through, steady and unyielding, outlining the only path that offered survival, a path that meant turning the mark that cursed her into a weapon that could save them. For she knew their signals, their codes, the language hidden in the hum of their engines and the flash of their lights, and she could weave her mark into a deception that would buy them time, but it meant standing at the front, it meant revealing herself not as prey but as the one who had defied them and lived, a beacon that would either draw their fury or shatter their cohesion. The general listened in silence, his jaw tight, and then he gave the nod that sealed not just a tactic but a bond, for he was no longer commanding her, he was standing with her. The hours that followed blurred into motion, preparations made with frantic speed as soldiers rebuilt barricades and rerouted power, while she stripped herself of every lie she had worn, revealing the brand on her skin for all to see, no longer a shame hidden in shadows but a rallying point etched in flesh. When she stepped onto the wall, the army fell into silence, every eye fixed on her, and for the first time she spoke not in whispers but in a voice that carried across the courtyard, telling them the truth of who she was, what she had survived, and why she would stand with them now. The general's voice followed hers, rough and commanding, binding her fate to theirs, and in that moment the soldiers no longer saw a marked traitor but a comrade reborn in fire. The faction's machines drew closer, their formation perfect, their weapons gleaming in the pale sun, but when her signal flared through the air, crafted from the code she had once memorized in blood, the formation shuddered, confusion rippling through their ranks, hesitation breaking the rhythm that had once been unshakable. The general seized the opening, his commands turning chaos into strategy, and the base erupted with fire not in desperation but in defiance. The battle that followed was unlike the night before, not a clash of shadows but a war fought in full light, where every shot and every cry was a declaration that they would not bend, not to fear, not to history. She fought at the general's side until her body burned, her arms heavy, her skin slick with sweat and blood, yet the mark on her arm no longer felt like a curse. It was a reminder of what she had broken, of chains shattered and choices claimed. As the hours dragged on, the machines faltered, their precision undone by doubt, and when the sun stood high overhead, the faction broke, retreating into the horizon with their losses bleeding into the sand. The base stood battered but unbroken, and in the silence that followed the soldiers turned not to the general but to her, their cheers rising in ragged unison, a sound that shook her more than any battle cry she had ever heard, because it was not born of fear or command but of respect. She met the general's gaze across the chaos, and in his eyes she saw no silence this time, no hesitation, only pride and a strange, quiet awe. The war was not over, she knew that, but the chains that had bound her were, and as she stood amid the smoke and ash, the mark on her skin gleaming in the harsh sun, she realized that the silence which had once defined her had given way to something louder, stronger, unstoppable. Her voice, her choice, her place among those who had seen her and chosen to stand beside her, not because of the mark she bore but because of the woman she had become. The end.